In the spring of 1902, on a Royal Navy testing range in England, an officer picked up a pistol, fired a single shot, and refused to fire it again. Not because it jammed, not because it missed, because the gun itself felt like an act of violence against the man holding it. The muzzle whipped toward the sky, the spent case came flying back past his head, and the shock traveled up his arm like he'd been struck with a hammer. The Navy's official report on those trials contains one of the most brutal sentences ever written about a firearm. No one who fired the pistol once ever wanted to fire it a second time. Here's what makes that sentence strange. The weapon on that table was not a failure of engineering. It was, by raw numbers, the most powerful handgun on the planet, and it would keep that title for more than 3 decades. Nothing you could hold in one hand would match its energy until the .357 Magnum arrived in 1935. This pistol wasn't behind its time. It was 35 years ahead of it, and the British military rejected it, then rejected it again, 8 times in total until the company behind it collapsed and its inventor went bankrupt. This is the story of the Gabbett-Fairfax Mars, the pistol that was too powerful to exist. To understand why anyone would build such a thing, you have to understand the problem that was driving gun designers insane at the end of the 1890s. The self-loading pistol had just been born. The Borchardt C93, the Mauser C96. These were mechanical marvels, weapons that reloaded themselves, that could pour out shots faster than any revolver. Armies across Europe were watching them closely, but they all shared one embarrassing weakness. The cartridges they fired were small, fast, and thin. A 7.63 millimeter Mauser bullet could punch a neat hole clean through a man, and the man would keep coming. For the British, this wasn't a theoretical concern. Their army had spent the 1890s fighting colonial campaigns, where officers reported over and over the same terrifying experience: a charging enemy absorbing multiple hits from a service pistol and still closing the distance with a blade. The British had already relearned this lesson the hard way once, ditching a smaller revolver caliber and going back to the big, slow 455 Webley, a round chosen specifically because it knocked men down. So when British officers looked at the new automatic pistols, they saw the future, firing a cartridge from the past nightmares. Fast-loading, yes. Man-stopping, no. That was the engineering challenge of the age, and in 1900 it looked genuinely unsolvable. Build an automatic pistol around a cartridge with real stopping power. The problem was physics. The simple mechanisms that made automatics work could only safely handle weak ammunition. A truly powerful round generated pressures and recoil forces that would tear those early designs apart. You could have automatic fire, or you could have power. Nobody had both. Nobody except a solicitor-turned-inventor from Leamington named Hugh Gabbett-Fairfax, who looked at this trade-off and simply refused to accept it. Between 1895 and 1900, he filed a string of patents chasing one idea with almost fanatical single-mindedness: a self-loading pistol built not around a compromised cartridge, but around the most powerful handgun ammunition ever conceived. While other designers asked, how much power can my mechanism survive? Gabbett-Fairfax asked the question backwards: how much mechanism does maximum power require? He wasn't designing a pistol. He was designing around a monster. Cartridges so long and so heavy that no existing pistol architecture could even feed them into the chamber. And here is the part that history tends to forget. He succeeded. The mechanism he created actually worked. It fed those enormous cartridges. It fired them. It extracted them and loaded the next round, cycle after cycle. In an era when most automatic pistols were fragile experiments, Gabbett-Fairfax built a gun that did the impossible, and if this story is the kind of engineering deep dive you're here for, A like and a subscribe genuinely helps these long-format breakdowns get made. Because next, we're going inside this machine. Because the Mars didn't work like any pistol before it, or honestly, any pistol after it. To handle its monstrous ammunition, Gabbett-Fairfax created one of the most bizarre, over-engineered mechanisms ever squeezed into something meant for one hand, a gun that loaded itself backwards. And buried deep inside that brilliance, invisible on any blueprint, was the one flaw no engineer on Earth could ever file away. Pick up almost any semi-automatic pistol made in the last 100 years, and the moment of firing works roughly the same way. The slide snaps back a short distance, the barrel barely moves, a fresh round gets shoved straight forward from the magazine into the chamber. One motion. Simple, fast, cheap. The Mars did none of this. When a Mars fired, the barrel and the bolt, locked together like a fist, recoiled together, sliding backwards across the top of the frame for the entire length of the cartridge. This is called long recoil, and it is one of the rarest operating systems in firearms history. It appeared in a handful of shotguns and rifles, and in pistols it remained an evolutionary dead end almost entirely occupied by the Mars. Gabbett-Fairfax didn't choose it to be different. He chose it because his ammunition left him no choice. A cartridge that powerful, in a conventional design, would begin opening the breech while pressure was still dangerously high. Long recoil kept everything sealed shut through the whole violent journey backwards, letting the pressure die before anything unlocked. And the lock itself was absurd for a handgun. The Mars used a rotating bolt with 4 heavy locking lugs, the kind of arrangement you'd expect inside a military rifle. When the trigger dropped the hammer, that bolt was rotated and cammed into battery, like an artillery breech in miniature. Engineers who have disassembled surviving examples describe the internals with a mix of admiration and disbelief. This wasn't a pistol mechanism scaled up. It was a rifle mechanism crushed down. But the strangest part, the thing that makes the Mars genuinely unique, is how it loaded. Every conventional pistol pushes the next cartridge forward out of the magazine. The Mars pulled it backwards. As the bolt flew rearward, a claw snatched the top cartridge out of the magazine tail first, dragging it back and up onto a lifting tray. Only then, as the barrel and bolt slammed forward again, was the round finally driven ahead into the chamber. 3 separate movements: extract backwards, lift, feed forward, where every other design on Earth used one. Why would anyone build that? Because the ammunition physically couldn't be fed any other way. The Mitre 45 Mars long cartridge was enormous, a bottleneck brass giant so long that pushing it nose first out of a grip-mounted magazine at a feeding angle simply didn't work. The magazine would have had to sit somewhere impossible, or the grip would have become too massive to hold. Pulling the round straight back and lifting it level with the bore was, in a strange way, the elegant solution. Elegant and catastrophically expensive. That single design choice meant dozens of additional machined parts. The claw, the lifter, the cam's end springs to time it all. Every extra part another cost, another delay on the production line, another place for dirt, wear, and failure to live. Now, the ammunition all this machinery existed to serve. Gabbett-Fairfax didn't develop one cartridge. He developed a family of monsters. An 8.5mm Mars, a 9mm Mars, and the king, the .45 Mars long. The numbers, even today, are hard to believe. The 8.5mm version threw its bullet at velocities around 530 meters per second, at a time when the standard British .455 Webley service round lumbered out at roughly 190. The big mismatch 45 Mars launched a heavy bullet with muzzle energy in the region of 600 foot-pounds and beyond in its hottest loadings, roughly triple the service revolver, and comfortably above the celebrated 7.63 Mauser, which had been marketed as the high-velocity wonder of the age. That 35-year head start you heard about at the beginning wasn't a figure of speech. These are the numbers behind it. Figures no production handgun cartridge would touch for a generation. Put the whole machine together and you get something that sounds like fiction. A pistol over a foot long, weighing more than a Mauser C96. Its barrel sliding, its bolt rotating, its cartridges dancing backwards and upwards through the action. And it worked. Witnesses at demonstrations watched the Mars digest its giant cartridges and cycle them flawlessly, again and again. On paper, in the workshop, on the measuring table, Gabbett-Fairfax had won. He had solved the unsolvable problem. Full automatic loading, maximum possible power, lock breech safety. Every individual engineering decision was correct. Which is exactly what makes what happened next so cruel, because a pistol is not a machine on a bench. It is a machine pressed into a human palm, aimed by a human eye, fired by a human nerve. And the moment the Mars met the human body, all of that immaculate, interlocking engineering began working, with the same mechanical perfection against the one component Gabbett-Fairfax couldn't redesign. Every gun obeys the same unforgiving arithmetic. The energy that drives the bullet forward drives the gun backward. There is no negotiating with Newton. You can only manage the consequences. And in 1901, the tools for managing them didn't exist yet. No recoil-absorbing polymer frames. No muzzle brakes venting gas upward. No ergonomic grip angles shaped by decades of research. Just steel, a wooden grip, and a wrist. Now run the numbers the Mars forced on that wrist. Triple the energy of the service revolver, channeled through a mechanism that made everything worse. Because long recoil has a hidden cost. It's not just the bullet's reaction the shooter absorbs. It's the mass of the barrel and bolt, pounds of steel, accelerating rearward across the frame and slamming to a stop almost against his hand. Firing a Webley was a push. Firing a Mars was being punched twice, in one instant. First by the cartridge, then by the machinery. Shooters reported the muzzle whipping so violently skyward that the pistol ended up pointing almost vertical. A second aim shot wasn't slow. It was, for practical purposes, impossible. You didn't re-aim a Mars. You wrestled it back down and started over. And then there was the signature horror, the one detail every man who fired it remembered. The ejected case didn't flick sideways, the way every modern pistol politely disposes of its brass. The Mars threw its spent cartridge straight back. At the shooter, a hot, smoking brass cylinder the size of a rifle case launched out of the action toward his face, whistling past his ear or bouncing off the brim of his cap. And here is the damning part. This wasn't a defect. It was the design. Remember how the Mars fed? Cartridges pulled rearward out of the magazine, along the gun's center line. The entire architecture moved ammunition backward, so the empty case exited backward too, directly over the shooter's hand and toward his head. To fix the ejection, you would have to undesign the feeding. To undesign the feeding, you'd have to abandon the giant cartridge. The Mars couldn't be corrected. It could only be abandoned. The British military gave it every chance not to be. This is what gets lost in the legend. The trials boards weren't hostile. They were interested. Between 1900 and 1903, the Mars came before official British testing on 8 separate occasions. The War Office's Small Arms Committee, then the Admiralty, examining variant after variant as Gabbett-Fairfax tweaked calibers and details. And 8 times, the answer came back. No. The reasons in the reports barely changed. The recoil was described as excessive to the point of being uncontrollable. Testers noted the violence of the action, the impossibility of rapid fire, the sheer fatigue of putting a magazine through the gun. Men who fired it came away fearing the wrong end of their own weapon. Some Navy testers reportedly left the range with sprained wrists and flinches that took days to fade. The Mars exhausted its shooters, and worse for a military weapon, it frightened them. Meanwhile, sitting on those same trial tables were the competitors. Pistols firing cartridges half as powerful, and the committees could see the trade with their own eyes. A man with a Webley or a Colt automatic put his shots on target, one after another, wrist steady, brass tinkling harmlessly to the side. A man with a Mars fired once and spent the next 2 seconds fighting his own weapon back onto the target while dodging his own ejected case. The boards drew the only conclusion a military can draw. A soldier's second shot matters more than his first shot's horsepower. Controllability beat power. It always does. There's one more nail, and it's a detail of pure historical timing. British pistol doctrine in 1900 still assumed one-handed shooting, an officer firing with his arm extended, saber or reins in the other hand, a stance inherited straight from the cavalry. The two-handed grip that every modern shooter uses to tame recoil wasn't just uncommon, it wasn't taught. The Mars was a pistol that demanded 2 hands, a braced stance, and a prepared shooter, offered to an army that officially shot with one. It wasn't just too powerful for its ammunition era. It was too powerful for how human beings held pistols. So by 1903, the verdict was physical, repeatable, and final. The Mars had defeated every problem made of steel and lost to the one made of flesh and bone. But here's what the trial reports don't tell you. Armies reject weapons all the time, and the weapons survive, get redesigned, find foreign buyers, live second lives. Rejection didn't have to kill the Mars. What killed it was quieter than any recoil, and it was already happening in Birmingham, in ledgers, invoices, and the quiet exit of the biggest gun maker in Britain. Here's a number that explains the death of the Mars better than any trial report. At the turn of the century, a Webley service revolver cost the British government roughly £3. Nobody knows the exact unit cost of a Mars because it was never produced in quantity, but the estimates that survive put it at several times that figure. And that gap wasn't greed, it was geometry. Every solution we walked through, the sliding barrel, the 4-lug rotating bolt, the claw, the lifter, the timing cams, existed as physical steel that someone had to machine, harden, polish, and fit. Not assemble, fit. The Mars was built the way Victorian craftsmen built shotguns for aristocrats. Each part filed to match its neighbors by hand, which meant parts from one pistol wouldn't reliably drop into another. In an era when armies were falling in love with interchangeable parts mass production, Gabbett-Fairfax had designed a weapon that structurally could not be mass-produced. The mechanism didn't just fight the shooter, it fought the factory. The first company to discover this was the best one in Britain to know. Webley of Birmingham, the Empire's revolver maker, the firm whose products sat in every officer's holster. Around 1898, Webley agreed to manufacture Gabbett-Fairfax design, and on paper the partnership made perfect sense. He brought patents that promised the future. They brought the finest pistol workshops in the country. If anyone could turn the Mars into a product, it was Webley. Instead, Webley became the first institution to lose money on it. Their machinists confronted the rotating bolt and the backward-feeding action and found that build times and costs ran wildly beyond anything a service pistol could justify. And the one thing that could have rescued the economics, a fat government contract spreading those costs across thousands of units, was exactly what the trial boards kept refusing to sign. Webley did the math a gunmaker does. Enormous cost per unit, 0 orders, no path forward. They walked away, went back to their revolvers, and, tellingly, began developing their own automatic pistols, chambered in sensible, controllable cartridges. Even the Mars's own manufacturing partner looked at it and concluded the future lay in less. Gabbett-Fairfax responded the way true believers do. He doubled down. In 1901, he pulled together private investors and formed the Mars Automatic Pistol Syndicate, Limited, a company with one product, one customer in mind, and one hope, that the next trial, or the one after, would end differently. With Webley gone, production scattered across small Birmingham trade shops, each batch slightly different as the design kept mutating in search of approval. This is why surviving Mars pistols are a collector's fever dream. Different calibers, different barrel lengths, different internal details, almost no two guns quite alike. These aren't production variants in the modern sense. They're snapshots of a drowning company redesigning its only product in real time. The Syndicate's ledger tells the rest with brutal simplicity. Total output across every caliber and variant over the entire life of the project. Roughly 80 pistols. Not 80,000, see 80. Somewhere in that number the money ran out and hope stopped being an asset. The final rejection landed, no foreign savior appeared, and in 1903, the Syndicate collapsed into liquidation. Hugh Gabbett-Fairfax was personally bankrupted by the venture. The man who had out-engineered every rival lost his company, his patents promise, and his fortune to a pistol that worked exactly as designed. He never brought another firearm to market. A handful of others briefly picked at the wreckage. A successor firm tried to keep the design breathing for a couple of years. But you cannot recapitalize physics. The recoil was still the recoil. The costs were still the costs. And then came the strangest funeral in firearms history. There wasn't one. When a failed military prototype dies, the pattern is usually oblivion, samples scrapped, tooling melted, the design surviving as a file in an archive. The Mars pistols escaped that fate almost by accident. The trial guns, the demonstrators, the Syndicate's stock, they were sold off, dispersed into private hands, carried away one by one into collections, drawers, and gunroom cabinets across Britain and beyond. Roughly 80 orphans scattered to the wind, each carrying inside it the most powerful handgun cartridge the world would see for a generation. At the time, that dispersal looked like the final indignity, the leftovers of a bankruptcy, sold for whatever they'd fetch. Nobody in 1903 could have guessed the truth. The liquidators weren't scattering debris, they were seeding a legend. Because the story of the Mars doesn't end in a Birmingham courtroom. It goes quiet for 3 decades. And then, in 1935, in an American ammunition laboratory, the idea Gabbett-Fairfax went bankrupt for comes roaring back. And this time, the world is ready for it. In 1935, Smith & Wesson and ammunition engineer Phil Sharp unveiled a cartridge that made headlines around the world. The .357 Magnum. Newspapers called it the most powerful handgun round ever made. Lawmen lined up for it. Legends grew around it. Stories of it cracking engine blocks, punching through car doors that swallowed ordinary bullets. It was hailed as a revolution, the dawn of the Magnum era. Except it wasn't the dawn. It was a rematch. The energy figures the .357 posted in 1935 were the figures the .45 Mars Long had been posting when Queen Victoria was still alive. The revolution had already happened 35 years earlier in Birmingham, and it had gone bankrupt. What changed in those 3 decades wasn't the idea. It was everything around the idea. Stronger steels that could contain the pressure in a simple revolver frame, no exotic mechanism required. Shooters who had learned slowly that a handgun could be gripped with 2 hands. A civilian market that didn't need committee approval to fall in love with excess. Gabbett-Fairfax hadn't asked a wrong question. He'd asked it in the wrong decade. And once the world caught up, it never stopped chasing his answer. The .44 Magnum in 1955. The Automag of the 1970s, which tellingly wrestled with the very same demons. A brilliant, over-engineered automatic around a monster cartridge. Adored by enthusiasts dead in bankruptcy within years. Then the Desert Eagle, a pistol that finally did what the Mars attempted, feeding Magnum-class rounds through a rotating bolt automatic action, using gas operation and modern metallurgy to tame what 1901 couldn't. Line them up and the family resemblance is unmistakable. Every oversized, overpowered hand cannon of the 20th century is answering the question Gabbett-Fairfax asked first. He didn't build a dead end. He built the trailhead. Which brings us to the part of this story you can still watch happen, with a paddle in your hand. Remember those 80 orphans scattered by liquidators for scrap value in 1903? Today, when one surfaces at auction, the room changes. Surviving examples, and far fewer than 80 are accounted for, have crossed the block at houses like Rock Island and Bonhams for sums running into the tens of thousands, with the rarest configurations pushing further still. Sit with the irony for a second. The British government declined to buy this pistol at a price a few times that of a 3-pound revolver. A century later, a serving officer of that same army couldn't afford one on a year's salary. The Mars now trades at the price of a car, and the price keeps climbing for a reason that would have made Gabbett-Fairfax laugh or weep. Every rejection letter, every trial report, every horrified quote from a Navy tester is now provenance. The failure is the value. You can also stand face to face with one without a fortune. The Royal Armories hold Mars pistols in their national collection, where the machine that terrified the Admiralty now rests behind glass, barrel gleaming, claw, and lifter frozen mid-dance. And that's the final twist this pistol had waiting, the one nobody at those trials could have seen. Imagine, for a moment, that the Mars had won. Softer cartridge, tamed recoil, a contract signed in 1902. It becomes a service pistol. It serves, ages, gets replaced, and dissolves into the gray crowd of adopted sidearms that only specialists remember. Adoption would have made it ordinary. Rejection made it singular. The 8 refusals didn't erase the Mars from history. They carved it in as the eternal what if, the monster in the margins of every book on automatic pistols. The gun collectors whisper about precisely because almost no one can have one. The British Army didn't kill this pistol. It canonized it. If this kind of story is why you're here, machines with biographies, engineering with a body count of careers and fortunes, subscribe, because the vault of weapons history is full of magnificent failures like this one, and most of them have never been given the telling they deserve. Drop a comment with the gun whose story you want open next. Somewhere in a Royal Navy report from 1902, there's a line about a man who fired this pistol once and never wanted to fire it again. He thought he was ending something. He was wrong. 120 years later, the pistol that punched its own shooters is still here, priceless, untouchable, undefeated. And the round it fired into history never stopped traveling.